Hello, everyone. This is Rosalind O'Connell from Advocacy Solutions. Welcome to the third and final advocacy webinar for Hereditary Amyloidosis Canada. Please note that everyone will be muted upon joining the webinar. And before we begin tonight's presentation, we'd just like to touch on a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded so that we can archive the presentation on the HAC website and share a link with those who were unable to participate today. Since everyone is muted and in the interest of keeping things organized, we would just ask that you submit your questions by typing them into the question panel on your on-screen dashboard. We're going to be holding all questions tonight until the end of the presentation, and then we'll do our best to address all the questions that we've received, depending on how many we do receive and the time allotted for this webinar. If you have any technical difficulties throughout this webinar, please use the chat icon, also located on your dashboard screen. Click on the drop-down menu and make sure you select Organizers to create a private chat with our digital specialist. Alternatively, you can email my colleague Lauren at advocacysolutions.ca, and she will do her best to answer your email as soon as possible. We'll now get started with the webinar. Anne-Marie, over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Rosalind. Thanks everyone for joining us again today for the last of our three-part webinar series focused on advocacy. For those of you who don't know me, I am Anne-Marie Carr, founder and executive director of Hereditary Amyloidosis Canada. We are really pleased to bring you these webinars to all of you who have been joining us over the past few weeks, and to those who have watched the recorded webinars afterwards. We had planned to bring this to you as introduction to advocacy at what would have been the first in-person meeting of our hATTR community. But that damn COVID-19 had other plans for us. What I would like to do is actually go back a couple of years, say for example to 2015. And that was at the time when I was first diagnosed with this disease. There were no treatment options, only symptom management. And when this was given to me, it felt as though it was a death sentence without parole or an expiration date. I felt like an island, isolated and very much alone. I knew nobody else with this disease, and the cardiologist that I was attending to at the time shrugged his shoulders when I asked what we can do with regards to this illness. After that, it was basically a bit of a downhill roller coaster, going through all the grieving processes. Nobody to share it with, really. Others said they understood, but I felt, how could they? They hadn't been diagnosed with this. I had. Anyway, it took a while to get through all of this, and then I had what I might refer to as an epiphany. Maybe having this disease, I could make a difference. Might not be for me, however, other family members, children, grandchildren, it was suggested to start up a hereditary organisation. And I took it upon myself to accept this. At least now I could participate, and maybe I had found a purpose for my life on this planet. Roll on to 2018, and what do we have today? We've got 3 treatment options, all approved by Health Canada and all under PCPA. I'm not sure. I'm sure someone will correct me if my information's not correct, but this is unprecedented within the rare disease community. Sometimes we don't even get the chance to have one drug. That being said, I believe soon all 3 of these drugs could be available, giving patients not only one drug, but perhaps a choice of treatment. The current status of these 3 treatments that have been approved are Tegsedi in inotersen has received a letter of intent from PCPA so that it may be publicly funded. Another drug Onpattro, patisiran, is also on the PCPA website, and that is listed as active negotiations. Last but by no means least, tafamidis Vyndaqel is listed as under consideration for negotiation. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is where you participate. As one person, the goals of advocacy cannot be accomplished. We're all patients. I know that we all have our days where we're not feeling the greatest. I understand that we can be out of our comfort zone with regards to advocacy. However, we need you to engage in whatever manner is most comfortable for you. And I implore you to help us to help you and yours. This is for our benefit and all our children, grandchildren, and family members, and all of those who come after us, sons, daughters, grandchildren. We want early diagnosis. Why? The reason we want this is because it leads to a much better prognosis. On that subject, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the individuals and the organisations who have so generously supported our work and helped us make this series possible. Axia, Alnylam, e-Iris, and Pfizer. All of those companies have been paramount in getting this to the stage that it's at with regards to the millions in research and technology and all their dedication of their scientists, their salespeople, everyone. And yeah, it's a critical time for us to learn about advocacy and how the drugs are approved and funded in Canada. By the end of the webinar tonight, our community will be ready to engage in advocacy to ensure that all Health Canada approved treatments for hATTR amyloidosis are acceptable through public funding to all those who can benefit from them, no matter where you live across the country. On your screen, you can see the agenda for tonight's webinar, and you'll note that we are focusing on how everyone can get involved in our advocacy work. But before we begin, I would like to thank the Advocacy Solutions team for being here with us, and I will ask Joanne and Rosalind to introduce themselves.
Great, thanks, Anne-Marie. I'm Joanne Kosky, and I'm the Managing Director of Advocacy Solutions.
And I'm Rosalind O'Connell, Senior Director at Advocacy Solutions. And on behalf of our colleagues, Ryan Clark and Lauren Wu, we are so pleased to have the opportunity to present this webinar series to the amyloidosis community over the past few weeks. And now I'll turn it back over to Joanne to get us started.
Great, thanks, Rosalind. So let's review once again, as we've done at the top of the other webinars, our objectives for this webinar series. They include to educate the hATTR amyloidosis community about advocacy and how drugs are approved and funded in Canada, to empower the community, your community, to take action in support of publicly funded access to treatment across Canada, and finally, to ensure that all Health Canada approved treatments for hATTR amyloidosis, as Anne-Marie explained so succinctly and passionately, are accessible to all patients who can benefit from them. And now let's just take a little quick look, an update on access to treatment. And actually, Anne-Marie walked us through this a little bit just previously, but just to let everyone know that since last week, the 3 drugs that Anne-Marie mentioned are still in the same place from where they were. And we're hoping that they're going to continue to move along in the processes. So Vyndaqel, we're waiting for some good news that it will begin active negotiations soon. Still under consideration. Onpattro in active negotiations, hoping that it will be concluded successfully soon with PCPA, and Tegsedi, which concluded successfully negotiations on April 30th. So things are definitely moving along. And just to remind everyone that HAC's engagement in these processes to date, along with the Rare Disease Organization in Quebec, our QMO, have been critical to ensuring that they continue to move along in these processes. So just before we get into it, let's just do a quick recap of webinar 1 and 2 for those of you who weren't able to join us, or for those of you who weren't able to review the recorded webinars after the fact. So webinar number 1, we covered all the fundamentals of good advocacy, including what advocacy is and why it's important. And we reviewed the 2 pillars of effective advocacy, Just a reminder what those are: the ability to prepare and share your personal story, and building and sustaining relationships with key decision makers. Then in webinar number 2, we took a much more in-depth look at how to tell your personal story for advocacy purposes, of course. And we also walked through in some detail the various processes involved in the approval and funding of drugs in Canada. And that's when many of you learned many different acronyms that we have to know and pay attention to in this world, with a focus on the 2 that are most relevant to the hATTR community today, and that is PCPA and PLA's product listing agreement. And at the end of the second webinar, we briefly introduced you to HAC's new stophATTRnow e-Advocacy campaign. And tonight, finally, we're going to look at the specific tools available through that e-Advocacy hub, as we call it. But before we do, let's first delve a little deeper into how we use advocacy tools and when. So if you joined us for or watched the recording of webinar number 1, you'll recall that the last step of our 5-step process to developing an effective advocacy plan is choosing your tool. You'll also recall that we explained that advocacy tools are the means of delivering the messages. Really anything that you have or produce that may be used to communicate with people is a potential tool in advocacy. But it's very important to be strategic in how you use your tools. Which brings me to the first point I would like to make, which is don't just throw every tool at the decision maker, and certainly not all at once. I'm sure that most of you will not do that, but just a little piece of advice. It's really important that you select the tools that you think the decision maker will be most receptive and responsive to, the ones that will elicit the most pressure at the appropriate time. Now, some tools will have absolutely no impact on your decision maker, which means that you'll be wasting your time and energy if you use them. So that's important to be able to determine. And consider the fact that some tools will be more effective at certain times than at other times. For example, during an election cycle with politicians, they may be paying more attention to Twitter, for example, than they will be to email. It's also really important to identify which tools that only you and those closest to you will use, such as media interviews, for example, and those that your supporters can actually use quite effectively, which still allow you to control the consistency of the messages being delivered. And that is really important in the advocacy work that we do. So a little bit more about using your advocacy tools to do with timing and the timing of when you use specific tools, which is critically important. Their use should really create what we call a layering effect, one on top of the other over time. And to do that properly really takes some planning and being strategic, as we talked about before. Be aware of timing of other activities or events or milestones that may influence when you choose to use a tool. And most importantly, give the decision maker a chance to engage in your issue and to respond to your one ask, which could impact your timing as well if they need a little bit more time to do what they need to do. So here's an example of how to layer advocacy tools. It's not the only way of doing it. It's just one way that we have used in the past, we use now, that we find very effective. You'll notice that some tools can be used earlier, later, or in some cases even more than once in your advocacy work. And the timing depends on the objective of using the tool and the messaging. So if the messaging has changed since the first time you use the tool, then you can certainly use it again. Now, you'll notice we sort of divide this into 3 layers. The first layer, we use tools, we suggest using tools like letters or phone calls, emails. You can have meetings at that point. initial meetings, and certainly, have events if you're going to focus on raising awareness and educating. Get to the second layer and you start to introduce things like e-advocacy. We're going to talk a bit about that tonight. Traditional and social media starts to play a role as a tool, mainly from an awareness perspective, but there could be some action messaging in that as well. And then you can certainly continue to hold events, but they may start to evolve from an awareness focus to an action advocacy focus as well. And then finally, you get to the third layer, which could continue on for some time. And then you'll continue to use your e-advocacy tools. You'll continue to have meetings, continue to reach out to the media and use social media. But at this point, you're going to start to introduce other tools that are going to be a little bit more assertive, if you will, petitions, postcards, and then your events are going to become a little bit more active, action-oriented as well. Now, of course, not all tools are included on this slide, and we really don't have time to review even the ones that are here, but we will walk you through 2 tools that you'll be using as soon as you are ready to start your advocacy work, which we hope will be right after this webinar. So let's start with the one that is the most impactful of the advocacy tools in our opinion, and that's either in-person meetings or, in today's world of COVID-19, virtual meetings with your advocacy target. On the slide, you can see the first 5 steps to preparing for your meeting that we suggest that you follow. Now, with respect to who will be attending the meeting, even if it's by phone or it's a virtual meeting, it's really important that you're not alone. You're not all on your own on that call, for example. And we'll talk about the different roles that people can play in meetings in just a moment. But what is most important, especially if you are meeting with politicians, is that at least one person participating in the meeting should have a personal story to tell about how the issue is affecting them. And typically, in the case of healthcare issues or health issues, that is the patient or their caregiver. Now, when you've decided to try to get a meeting, understand that no is not an option. You really need to decide going into this process, I will not give up until I get my meeting. Tell yourself that over and over again, often. So be realistic about who you need to meet with in order to minimize your frustration and disappointment. So there may be a number of different targets, and if you set your goals a little bit too high, then it may be challenging for you, but it's a step-by-step process. Now, we really suggest that you make an initial telephone call when you first decide to get that meeting, but have a letter or an email prepared that you can immediately send afterwards that briefly outlines why you want to meet with that person. And then follow up, follow up, follow up. We can't say it enough. This is your meeting, so if you want it, it really is your responsibility to pursue it relentlessly. Be persistent. And if you're offered the chance to meet with someone else, understand that this is not an alternative. So take it, we would suggest, take the opportunity, but continue to pursue the actual decision maker that you need to get to, that you have decided at the beginning to target your efforts. So let's talk a little bit about before you actually have your meeting. So you've got it, it's scheduled, and you're starting to prepare. First thing that we're going to suggest is that you provide some information to your decision maker to read ahead of time. They'll certainly appreciate this, or their staff will. It's not unreasonable, though, to assume that the decision maker will not have had time to read the material, especially if they're a busy politician, if they're a cabinet minister, for example. So never assume that they have. And if you're in doubt, when you meet with them, when you speak with them, certainly feel free to ask, and then you'll know where you stand, how much you may want to repeat. The material that you provide should be brief, simple, and deliver your 3 key messages and your 1 ask that we spoke about during the first webinar. And keep in mind that you are competing for this meeting time with every other person and organization that that person is meeting with. So you've got to be impactful. And usually you're going to find that you're going to have to be impactful in a shorter period of time than you thought you had. So speaking of time, it's also good to know how long the meeting is scheduled for, and always plan for it to be shorter so that you're sure to cover everything that you want to discuss. Now, let's talk about a question that we often get from advocates or people who are listening to our webinars. Who should attend the meeting? As you can see on the slide, we suggest that 3 to 4 people at the most attend, including you. But make sure, this is important, that everyone has a reason for being there, so a role to play, and that could be, taking notes, and that's a very important role, in fact. But make sure also that everybody knows why they're there. And that is, of course, to talk about the issue at hand and not something else that might get you derailed in your meeting. So ideally, you want to have people at the meeting with you or on the phone with you who can paint a complete picture of the issue from a few different perspectives. So think about that when you're deciding who to ask to be there with you. Do they bring something slightly different to the table regarding the same issue that you're talking about? And the last bullet on your screen you'll see gives an example of one combination of people which we've had very good results with. And in fact, it may be easier to do it this way now with this group of people, given that virtual meetings are going to be more the norm for a while, because you'll tend to have maybe better access to these types of people. So for example, somebody from an organization, a patient group, the content expert, so that could be a physician, but it could also be a caregiver. And then the individual impacted. So ideally the patient would be present, but that's not always necessary if it's not possible. So not to worry about that. Now, what about after the meeting? So you've had your meeting, it was a success, you feel really good about it. What do you do next? You've put so much effort into this work so far, so it's important to try and stay top of mind following your initial meeting with your decision maker. So one thing we always suggest is to send a thank you note after the meeting, which can absolutely recount the tangible commitment that the decision maker may have agreed to. Now, you can do this partly to help you stay top of mind, as I just mentioned, but also to create a record or a trail that gives you something to refer back to if you ever need to. So if you're chatting again with the decision maker is being interviewed by the media, and they don't recall making that commitment to you, you can kind of go back and you've got this record of them having said what they said. So if you think of something that your decision maker will respond to, something else you can try is tweeting your thanks to your decision maker and tagging others as appropriate to add extra pressure. So if you're comfortable on Twitter, that's a great way to publicly thank your decision maker for taking the time to meet with you. And if you do that, in this case, don't forget to tag the patient group, hAC, that you're working with, because that'll help everybody track the success that everyone is having in the campaign. And just to finish off this part of the webinar, here you can see some tips on your screen for in-person meetings that are still really good to keep in mind for virtual meetings as well. And if you remember nothing else about what we've just discussed, remember this. Effective advocacy is about 3 things: presenting, listening, and responding. So listening in a meeting, we can't underscore enough, is so important. If you hear yourself talking continuously, please stop yourself. Well, we do that especially when we're nervous. We fill air. So here's why it's important that you do stop. If you don't do it, then you're making it way too easy for the decision maker by letting them get away with having to say nothing during the meeting, and therefore not having to address your key messages or your one ask that you've spent so much time crafting and articulating. So now let's move on to two more tools that we have available to us in our advocacy work. I'm going to start with the media. In advocacy, traditional and social media can be a conduit to sharing messages with a broader audience and can help amplify your voice. Social media in particular can be a really simple way to expose people who care about you to your issue. Now, going to traditional news media or social media with your issue or your story definitely is effective in expanding and ultimately amplifying the conversation that you're having from a one-to-one meeting behind a closed door with a decision maker, an elected official, to one-to-one to suddenly many. Now, making a private issue public through the media can increase pressure on a decision maker as well to bring about change. And that's because more people will have heard about your issue and what you're doing, and they'll feel more pressure as a result. So you'll want to consider which media outlet, if you decide to go to the media with your story, will be most interested, and that could change as your story evolves. So it could start out as being a community-based issue that only affects you, a resident of that community, but evolve into a broader issue that impacts people like you all across the province or across the country. And as that evolution happens, different types of media outlets will become interested in what you have to say. But it's also important to consider when is the best time to go to the media. And as you're probably guessing, this is a part of layering, as we discussed earlier. Now, at this point in the presentation, if we were together in person, I would always ask how many of you have been interviewed by a reporter. And those of you who have know that it can be a very empowering experience. But as I always like to say, it isn't for everyone, which is why in this day and age, sharing your story through social media can be less daunting for some people and certainly can be considered as an alternative. So a little bit more about media, just to talk now about when the right time is to take your story to the media. And we always want to remind people that in advocacy, doing that is not usually the first step that you will take in an advocacy campaign, going to the media, unless the goal or your goal is to provide background on a little known issue, a rare disease that no one knows anything about and you would like to educate, or there's an urgent need to draw attention to an issue. And that's why going to the media with your story is not usually in layer number 1 in our little layering diagram that we had on the screen before. But if it is, it's because, and I'll say this again, you are either laying the foundation for advocacy through awareness, or there's an urgency around your ask. So take your story to the media only after you have gone directly to the decision maker. Once again, give them that chance to help you. Reporters will ask you if you've done this. When you're interviewed by them, they'll ask that question. And if you haven't, they'll ask you why not, why you haven't gone to your decision maker first before sharing the issue publicly. And that goes for social media as well. Just keep in mind that it is the elected official's job to at least try and help you, and it's your job to take that issue to them to give them that opportunity. Now, if the person that you're advocating to isn't the ultimate decision maker with respect to your issue, then we wanted to let you know that they may be willing to engage with the media alongside you. And we've seen this happen time and time again, where advocates will have an opportunity to be interviewed by a reporter, and they'll invite their local elected official to join them for that interview. And that elected official will be very, very happy to do that and be seen publicly as being supportive of their constituents. So don't be afraid to ask that. And finally, as I mentioned, you need to give the decision maker the chance to do their job, but If they are taking too long and they need another push, then you've reached layer number 3 and you can go back to the media with updated key messages to reflect where you are in your advocacy efforts. Okay, so the last tool that we're going to talk about before we go on to the specifics of the tools that you have available to you right now is e-Advocacy. Now, in the past, advocacy was limited to real-world encounters and tangible activities. But today, the internet has opened up endless channels for advocacy, making it possible for more people to engage than ever before. We want you to understand that e-Advocacy is a spectrum of activities or actions that vary in time, commitment, and level of difficulty. And the real challenge that we face is converting passive support, so doing the quick and easy activities, to active engagement that takes more time, but it's the key to effective advocacy. And while e-Advocacy can be extremely powerful and persuasive, taking action in the real world is often considered the holy grail of advocacy. And that's why we spend so much time talking about meetings, for example, which is a high value, real world action that can be very effective in advocacy. But for an advocacy campaign to be successful, we need a variety of activities. So that includes some that are high volume exercises, and that's where e-Advocacy really plays an important role. And we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. There are so many different tools and channels that you can use in e-Advocacy, and these are just a few in the second bullet that you can see on your screen, many of which your community is already going to start using at the end of this session. So again, consider your audience when you're deciding what e-Advocacy tools to use, both in terms of their impact and the shareability of their content. And simply by changing the tone or content of the key messages, e-Advocacy tools can be layered in at almost every stage of an advocacy campaign, as you saw on the layering slide earlier. So with that, we're now going to shift our discussion to the actual tools that you now have access to through HAC's e-Advocacy campaign website, or hub, as we like to call it. And I'm going to turn it over to Rosalind, who is going to walk you through the specifics.
Thank you, Joanne. So through the Stop hATTR campaign hub, HAC is providing all of these tools to help support your advocacy work. Some of these tools are quick and easy tools, and some tools like setting up a meeting may take a little longer, but can be very impactful, or as Joanne mentioned, those are the high value, real world, actionable tools. But in the meantime, here are 3 things you can do right away to help stop hATTR now. Number 1, you can email your provincial elected representative by visiting the e-Advocacy hub and clicking on the Email Your Provincial Representative tab. This will take you to a form where you can easily add your name, your province, your postal code, and then choose from a drop-down list of select government representatives and send them a pre-populated email that's already there ready for you to send. Number 2, you can click on any of the pre-populated tweets on the website, which are already written for you, and you can use those to contact decision makers in your province. Once you've taken action, you can share links on your own social media channels to encourage others to send an email or share a tweet to their representatives as well. And thirdly, you can meet with your provincial elected representative. So with that, let's start by looking at the documents to help you with number 3, meeting with your elected representative. And we call these advocacy packages. And there is one for each province that can be found on the campaign hub. As Joanne spoke about earlier in the webinar, meetings, either in person or virtual, are the most impactful advocacy tool you have available to you. The materials found in the provincial advocacy packages on HAC's e-Advocacy hub are outlined here on this slide. Please note that there is also a French version of the Quebec advocacy package available on the hub, and it's also accessible through the French link provided on this slide. Now let's review the actual materials in the packages with a focus on how to use each one. You'll notice that some of the materials are meant to be used as written, for example, a key facts document, while others are templates that are meant to be altered or customized somewhat. One example of that is a letter to the minister, and I'll make that distinction as we go along. The first document in the advocacy package is the Introduction to Advocates. This document is not meant to be altered. It's an overview or guide to the rest of the materials that you'll be using. It's also a good snapshot or overview of the hAC Advocacy Campaign. The campaign is pretty straightforward. It's to engage provincial elected officials to ensure that all Health Canada approved therapies for hATTR amyloidosis are accessible through public funding across the country. You'll notice the acronym MPP in the text on the screen. That's because we're using the Ontario Advocacy Package as an example, and provincial elected representatives in Ontario are called members of provincial parliament, or MPPs. But depending on where you live and which province you live in, they can also be called MNAs, MLAs, and MHAs. This second document, the letter to your elected representative, is absolutely meant to be altered, specifically to add some content around your personal story. As you may remember from last week's webinar on telling your personal story, we can't emphasize enough the importance of taking 5 minutes or so to insert some personal text about the link that you have to hATTR amyloidosis between paragraphs 1 and 2. It will really set the tone with your provincial representative in terms of how important this issue is to you, and that they can understand the issue from your point of view from a personal aspect. So where you see the text in red, that is where you should insert the content specific to you for your provincial elected representative. There is really only one objective of this letter, and this is to get a meeting with that representative. So where the text is black, we ask that you don't alter that, because the messaging here has been carefully crafted and reviewed for the purposes of this campaign. And as previously mentioned, this meeting may take the form of a telephone call or a virtual meeting rather than in person at this time, given the current COVID-19 situation. This third document, the meeting script outline, is one of those documents that may be altered, but in one specific place, which I'll touch on in a moment. Other than that, it should remain as it is. Your meeting script outline is what you should have in front of you when you meet with your provincial representative, or have in front of you while you're on the telephone call with them. You don't need to provide a copy to that person if it's in person, but you also don't need to hide it. Just place it on a table in front of you or have it within view so that you can refer to it when necessary. Think of this document as your guide to help keep the discussion focused on the most important points that you want your provincial elected official to know. The only thing you may want to add to this is embedding, again, your personal story next to number 5, about you. This is totally up to you. Some people want everything in the meeting script outline because they find that helpful, while others, when they get to this section, like to pick up a separate piece of paper and read their personal story from that page. And finally, number 9, conclusion. Typically, we would encourage you to take a photo with your provincial representative if you were in person, for example, with them, so that hAC can compile a visual record of all of your efforts. However, since these meetings will likely be conducted by telephone or virtually, you can skip this step and instead focus on sending a thank you email to your provincial elected official and mention that you will be following up with them in the coming days or weeks. This fourth document is your meeting report back form. It is meant to be altered in the sense that this is a document that you're meant to fill out following the meeting with the details of how that meeting went. The content requested is pretty straightforward. All we want to emphasize or ask is that you please take the time to do it. Please fill it out within a day or so of your meeting so that you don't forget any of the details of what was discussed. And also that, you know, it's really important to note anything that you think would be important for hAC to be aware of that happened during that meeting. And then finally, forward it on to hAC at the email address on the e-Advocacy Hub and in this at the bottom of this form. When hAC gets enough of these report back forms in a campaign, they can serve as a critical guide to shaping how we progress and potentially alter and adjust what we're doing. The fifth document is a letter from your elected provincial representative to the Minister of Health. This is a document that can be altered, but in this case, not by you. It's the second of 2 documents that you should hand to your provincial representative or forward to them after the meeting, which they can choose to amend before sending off to the Minister of Health. So when you get to number 8, dialogue, part of the meeting script outline, this is where you should tell the person that you're meeting with that you have a draft letter for their consideration that they can send in writing to the Minister of Health. You can provide them with a copy of the draft letter and then tell them that you will forward a Word version of it within 24 hours after speaking as a reminder, and they can prepare the final version that they want to send on to the minister. Remember to ask them both in the meeting and in your follow-up email to be copied on the letter that they send so that you know it was sent. And finally, this 6th document is different from the 5th document since it's a letter from you this time to send directly to your provincial Minister of Health. Like the letter you sent to your provincial elected representative to request a meeting, which is document 2, this letter is also meant to be altered to add some content around your personal story, but this time it's for the Minister of Health. In fact, we typically recommend that you simply take the personal story that you prepared previously and drop it into this letter between paragraphs 1 and 2. Again, we can't emphasize enough the importance of taking a moment to do this. When the minister receives a bunch of these letters, it will be important that they all be personalized to some extent. So again, where you see the text in red, this is where you should insert the content specific to you and the Minister of Health. And the last document in the advocacy package is the key facts and fact sheet. This final document should not be altered, but it is one of only 2 things that you can certainly provide to your provincial representative. The first one, of course, is being the letter for them to send to the Minister of Health, and the second one is this key facts document. What we usually suggest when you get to that part of the meeting where you can share what we call your core facts is to read off a few of the points on this fact sheet that you feel are most impactful, and then you can always forward a copy of it in your follow-up email to thank them, and so that they have this fact sheet to refer to in the future. Everything in this document is relevant and important, but if there are some bullets that you think might really grab their attention, or they just grabbed your attention, then you can mention those on the call or in the meeting and encourage them to read the rest when they receive the document from you after the meeting concludes. The advocacy packages can be found on this page of the Campaign Hub. And as we mentioned before, there are 11 packages, and there is one in English for each province and one in French for Quebec. And here's exactly how you can find the advocacy packages on the campaign website. So we have a little demonstration that we'd like to show you. So that was easy. And with that, we've come to the end of this webinar series. But now you have the knowledge and the tools you need to visit www.madhatter.ca/advocacy to start advocating. You can start preparing your personal story, and you can also email HAC if you would like a copy of the how-to guide in developing your personal story for some tips on how to do that. Let us know if you're interested in joining the campaign by emailing HAC with the following details: your name, the province you live in, and a little bit about yourself. Also, you'll see on the advocacy site that it's available in French. I think we've mentioned that before, but it's just a good reminder that that is available for those on the phone. Now I'll turn it over to Anne-Marie to say a few final words before we answer some of your questions.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed, Rosalind. That was great. And thank you to the Advocacy Solutions team for sharing your wealth of knowledge and also your time with us throughout this important webinar series. which, as we all know, has been focused on empowering our community to take action in advocacy. We truly are well prepared to begin our work. Just a reminder, this webinar series has been recorded, and this one will be posted with the other two on our website for viewing at your convenience. And now we do have some time for questions, so I'm going to pass it back to Rosalind to read out some of the questions that we may have received from participants. I'm passing it back to you again, Rosalind. Thank you.
Emery. Thank you. And just a reminder, if you would like to submit a question, you can do so by submitting it through the on-screen control panel in the question section. We'll just give people a few minutes perhaps to see if there are any questions from the group on tonight's call. And if you don't want to submit any questions, you can, like through this platform, you can certainly send them to the info@madhatter.ca email address. We'll just give everyone a minute or so.
Henry, maybe while we're waiting to see if people want to submit some questions, we can talk about the timing of this work to begin and the sort of more concentrated effort that might be helpful if people are able to sort of focus their efforts in the upcoming months. I don't know if you wanted to say a word or two about that.
Yeah, not a problem, Joanne. I think in terms of where we are with the 3 drugs that we have that we want obviously publicly funded, I think time is of the essence at the moment, and the quicker that we can establish and advocate and get in touch with all our MPPs, I think the sooner the better in terms of this, because it is current, and I don't know if I'm being too optimistic, but there is, in my mind anyway, that this may very well come to fruition in the next maybe 30, 60 days. But it's not going to happen if we just sit back and if we're inactive. We have to be active in terms of doing this. Otherwise, other things get priority in terms of PCPA and everything else.
So yeah, it doesn't look like we have any questions on tonight's webinar. However, if maybe people want to go and take a look at the e-Advocacy Hub, try it out. And if you do have any questions, again, feel free to email info@madhatter.ca, and happy advocating.
Well, thank you very much, Rosalind. I think, like everyone else, we know we've got a lot of information out there, and I'm guessing we actually want to go through that information, figure out what to do, how to do it, and get the ball rolling. So thanks very much again, Rosalind. And if anyone does have any questions, as Rosalind has said, please feel free to reach out anytime through our website, Facebook pages, email, or phone. Since there's no questions at the moment, I will just end by saying thank you to all of you who have joined us for these webinars, and we look forward to working alongside you as we advocate for publicly funded access to all approved treatments for hATTR amyloidosis all across this country. Stay well and be safe, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you very much. Good night.